Hi, this is a presentation on the Vietnam War. So, start of the Vietnam War first. Vietnam used to be called French Indochina. It was controlled by the French during the mid 19th century when colonization was happening. During World War II, Japan took over because France was obviously occupied by the Nazis. Ho Chi Minh, a person that learned about communism and fell in love with it. He's going to lead an independence movement against the Japanese while World War II is happening. Once World War II is over, France wanted its territory back, and because the U.S. needed as many allies as it could for the Cold War, it decided to help France out. France does a poor job of trying to win this battle to take over Vietnam. And by 1954, they actually leave, not being able to fight against the communist fighters there. As a result, Vietnam was split into two sections, similar to Korea following World War II. North Vietnam is going to be communist and led by Ho Chi Minh. South Vietnam is going to be democratic. It's going to be backed up by the United States, and they're going to have a premier. His last name is Dinh Diem. So U.S. is going to back up South Vietnam. Communists are going to be North Vietnam, very similar to the Korean War. This is a map of Vietnam. Most people assume it's an island. It's not. It's right underneath China. Its neighbors are Laos, Thailand, and Cambodia. South Vietnam, its capital being Saigon, is the democratic part. It's separated by a demilitarized line, just like Korea. And North Vietnam was communist, and its capital was Hanoi. This is Ho Chi Minh, educated in France, actually worked in the United States for a while, and would come back to Vietnam to turn it into a communist state and fight against the Japanese, the French, and then eventually the United States. So before LBJ takes over and escalates the war in Vietnam, we did have American involvement before that. Eisenhower had sent 900 U.S. advisors. Kennedy had upped it up to 16,000 advisors. These advisors only advised South Vietnam military on how to fight against North Vietnam. So they weren't active militarily, they were just giving advice and trying to help them coordinate. There is some rumors that Kennedy was going to lower the amount of troops and pull our troops out of Vietnam, but we don't know because Kennedy was assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald in 1963 in Dallas, Texas. LBJ takes over, and the Secretary of State under Kennedy suggests to LBJ that they should increase the troop levels to rid Vietnam of communism and continue the containment policy that was popular in the 1940s, 50s, and obviously in the 60s. There's Robert McNamara, who used to work at the Ford Motor Company, became the Secretary of Defense under JFK, would continue under LBJ. He is going to be extremely unpopular because of the stance of escalating the amount of troops in Vietnam. What allows LBJ to escalate the amount of troops? It was the Tonkin Gulf incident. Um, so LBJ comes on national TV and says that the USS Maddox, the USS ship, was attacked by North Vietnamese vessels in the Tonkin Gulf. The U.S. shot down two of the enemy vessels that had fired on it, and then they sent air attacks in retaliation against North Vietnam. In reality, the Maddox, the U.S. ship, was spying on North Vietnamese vessels, and they had fired the first shot without North Vietnamese not even attacking them. So LBJ lied um, to the American public. Public got all hot and bothered about it, and this allowed LBJ to increase the amount of troops in Vietnam. Furthermore, Congress passes the Tonkin Gulf Resolution in response to this, and they actually willingly gave up their constitutional power to declare war to the president. If you know anything about the Constitution, only Congress can declare war on another country, not the president. They gave this up in the 1960s, 1965, I believe, and gave it up to the president so the president could send as many troops as he wanted without declaring war, and that's what LBJ would do. So this is Robert McNamara showing the USS Maddox and where it was attacked by North Vietnamese missiles. I think they threw a map on there to confuse Americans. As you know, we're not very good at geography. So we're like, oh yeah, they did attack us. Now, for our troops, we are going to have a draft. First, people willingly volunteered for the war, just like in other American conflicts. But eventually, we are going to have a draft. I think it was done by birthdays or social security numbers. I always forget which one because each draft is a little bit different. Eventually, 2 million Americans are going to serve. These troops are younger, poor, and less educated than those in World War II in Korea. 30% of the draftees were exempt or deferred. Exempt meaning that they didn't have to fight. A lot of them, if you were a college student, you did not have to fight. Or if you had a job that was considered essential, such as a teacher. That's why a lot of males in the 1960s and 70s became teachers, so they didn't have to go off to war. Or you could be deferred. You're deferred because you either have some kind of physical or mental issue that doesn't allow you to serve. Springsteen was deferred because he wasn't physically fit. Donald Trump was deferred, I think, 4 times because of bone spurs. He couldn't march because he had brittle bones in his foot. Bill Clinton kind of dodged it a little bit, former president, because he had a Rhodes Scholar. He was learning in England that time. People that could not be exempt or deferred were people who were poor. And African Americans and Hispanics are going to serve in high numbers because they couldn't be exempt or deferred. Just to show you an example, African Americans were 24% of all battle deaths, but yet they only represent 11% of the U.S. population. So that means more African Americans are fighting in this war, and doesn't reflect the true demographics of the United States at that time. Where are they fighting? They're fighting in jungles, rice paddies, and rural villages. Another thing to note is that they fought to just defend South Vietnam from becoming communist. We never actually attacked North Vietnam. We never crossed that DMZ, that demilitarized zone, into North Vietnam. All right, we just were on the defensive. So we had, on the ground war, 1965, 1967, you could see this escalation, 185,000 troops. It's going to expand to almost 500,000 U.S. troops, eventually surpassing 500,000 troops on the ground in South Vietnam. We were fighting 2 enemies during this time. One, we're fighting the North Vietnamese army. They're pretty easy to figure out because they are just normal soldiers in uniforms, just like the Nazis run around. Oh, there's a Nazi. He's in a uniform. Let me shoot him. The enemy that was more problematic was the Viet Cong, also known as Victor Charlie, also just shortened to Charlie. That's why if you ever watch Forrest Gump, and they're like, "Oh, we're looking for a guy named Charlie." Charlie is the Viet Cong, Victor Charlie. They were confusing because they are people from South Vietnam. This is what U.S. is defending, but they were sympathetic to communism. So we couldn't tell who was a Viet Cong and who wasn't a Viet Cong in South Vietnam, which is kind of confusing. So a person during the day, this peasant could be waving at you, "Oh, we love America," but at night they could be shooting at you. So you just couldn't kill every South Vietnamese because um, you couldn't tell who was good and who was bad. And obviously, this is troublesome for American troops. Things that they do to help deal with the Viet Cong issue. One, they go on search and destroy missions. This is they go from village to village looking for weapons and ammunition, and they would destroy that stuff to make sure that the Viet Cong couldn't attack them. Another episode they're going to start doing, or a strategy they're going to use, is pacification to pacify the Viet Cong. They're going to go into villages, they're going to remove the villagers and burn them, these villages down to the ground. So again, Viet Cong couldn't organize and put their supplies in some places. As you can imagine, with these search and destroy missions and pacification, we were not winning the hearts and minds of South Vietnamese. We were actually pushing them more to be sympathetic to the North Vietnamese and communism, creating more enemies in South Vietnam. 1967 was one of the bloodier years during the Vietnam War, where 16,000 Americans were killed. This guy, PFC Hill, Private First Class Edward Hill, served in the Marines during the Vietnam War. He actually was not drafted, he enlisted. And this is him landing in Vietnam with some aviator glasses that he had stole from a helicopter pilot. He might look familiar because that is my pops. He fought for 2 years in the jungle. He won the Purple Heart. Purple Heart is when you get wounded in battle. He got shot in the leg. Eventually, he's going to leave the Marines, and through the GI Bill, he's going to go to college, something he could not afford before the Marines. So he loved the Marines for providing discipline in a problematic childhood and for the opportunity to get his education. But the idea of war, he kind of changed his mind about war, and he wanted to make sure that I would never serve in a military type capacity. That's how much he hated war, I guess you could say, after his experience. These are the Hueys, probably the most important innovation during the Vietnam War. Helicopters had been around like during the tail end of World War II and Korean War, but they become extremely important during the Vietnam War. The Huey helicopters. They were the taxi cab service, dropping soldiers up, uh, dropping them off at battle, and picking them up. As you can see, lining up almost like their 34th Street in New York City. They're fighting in rice paddies, and this is them walking in the wet cold. They have a extreme rainy season in Vietnam where it will rain for like 3 or 4 months straight, which is pretty insane. But if you ever seen the movie Forrest Gump, you said the most important thing to do is change your socks to avoid getting trench foot, a lesson they learned in World War One. These are the jungles they were fighting in. Imagine trying to fight an enemy in these conditions. A little different from like the Battle of the Bulge or D-Day, where everything's kind of clear. They're fighting against people who are not on the same level technologically or militarily as the United States. These Vietnamese, had primitive methods, not as many resources, but this allowed them to fight guerrilla warfare. Because they had been fighting for about 100 years against the French, and then the Japanese, and then the French again in the United States, they had these tunnels that they had been building for years upon years. And they were pretty elaborate. They had places where they could sleep, places where they can get water, places where they could plan stuff. And if you attacked from here, they would just go somewhere else. Some American troops were recruited to be tunnel rats, where they would go into the tunnels looking for the Vietnamese. They would be given a flashlight and a revolver to go in there. I couldn't imagine going in there. My father never had to do it because he stood at 6'3", and that would be impossible for him to go through. Again, Americans have machine guns, they have Huey helicopters, they have fighter jet planes, and the Viet Cong are using guerrilla tactics such as booby traps, where they would use a cartridge, they would disguise it with bamboo and leaves and grass. An American troop would step on it, would detonate, it would blow his legs off and some of his comrades. It wouldn't kill him necessarily, but by having 3 or 4 people injured, that would require another 12 people to remove these soldiers back to the Huey, and this would reduce their numbers and kind of slow down the Americans. Another tool they used were punji sticks. What they do is they would sharpen pieces of wood or bamboo. They would hide it with grass or other things again, and Americans would step on it. Like, oh, so what's the big deal? They would have a cut. No, they would actually smear it with animal and human feces. So when it punctured the American, the feces would get into the blood system and lead to nasty infections. And there is our favorite Vietnam soldier, Forrest Gump. Those are the North Vietnamese Army, aka the NVA, and easy to spot because they are all in uniforms. They all have, they're marching. Pretty easy to figure out who they are and who to fire. The problem was the Viet Cong. This guy is Viet Cong. Can you tell he's Viet Cong? No, you can't, because he's just like any other person in South Vietnam. This is actually a South Vietnamese general. He's on our side. Finds the Viet Cong, decides to execute him in the middle of the street. This was caught in a Pulitzer Prize winning photo. Pacification, again, going from village to village, burning it down to the ground, removing the villagers to create safe zones where the Viet Cong couldn't assemble or put any of their weapons. We have air war, we have air superiority, we have the best technology in the world at that time, and we employ Operation Rolling Thunder to bomb them back into the Stone Age, as they said back in that day. The main target was Ho Chi Minh Trail, which I'll show you in a second. We're dropping about 800 tons of bombs a day through this operation, and it did nothing. We're using napalm, which is petroleum mixed in a bomb form, so it would stick to the skin of the victims and would kind of just burn the skin off the enemies. Pretty nasty stuff. Because those jungles were so dense, we started dropping defoliants to help kind of clear away all the vegetation in the jungle so it would be easier for us to spot our enemies. The chemical we use is called Agent Orange, and it helped destroy these jungles and plant life. What we didn't know is it was also a cancer agent. So if American troops walked through that jungle that used to, that they used Agent Orange to get rid of, when they walked in, they could pick up the traces of Agent Orange, and they could. It was found that they had cancer or other physical ailments that would bother them for the rest of their lives. My dad was checked for it. He was actually negative for it, so one good thing. but it was also left there for many years, many decades, and a lot of the Vietnamese that went back in there suffered from high levels of cancer. So this is the Ho Chi Minh Trail. As you can see, this is North Vietnam and this is South Vietnam. They wouldn't just march across the demilitarized line. Instead, they would go into neighboring Laos and Cambodia and sneak attack South Vietnam, the place that we were guarding. So we started doing Operation Rolling Thunder of bombing these trails, but the next day they would just rebuild and rebuild and rebuild. So it actually did nothing. Here's our air superiority. Again, we have the best technology, the best military in the world, but yet we're going to lose to people using punji sticks and booby traps. There they are, 800 tons of bombs a day. We still lost. There is the napalm, pretty nasty stuff. And you can see maybe the experience of the defoliants kind of blowing the jungles away and affecting the kids either hit by napalm or by the Agent Orange. There's a video here if you want to check it out, find out a little bit more about Agent Orange. As the war dragged on, people started protesting against it. It was mostly college students and high school kids that are protesting it. One of the first anti-war teach-ins, not a sit-in that we saw from the civil rights movement, but a teach-in was at the University of Michigan, 1965. They started an organization called the SDS, or Students for a Democratic Society. They started attacking any symbols of the military. They started burning their draft cards and dodging the draft altogether. They started chanting, "Make love and not war." One of the most famous chants they had was, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" And they would chant this outside the White House where LBJ could hear it. Women are striking for peace. And we have anti-war rallies in New York City and DC, bringing hundreds of thousands of people. Cool little video on how people dodged the draft. Some people smoked cigarettes laced with ink. So when somebody took a X-ray, it looked like they had pneumonia. Some people would actually binge on sugar before they were tested, and it looked like they had high sugar levels. They had diabetes. They couldn't serve. Some people even faked that they were homosexuals. The military had a rule against homosexuals serving in the military, so some people actually pretended that they were gay to avoid being drafted into the military. So people were desperate not to fight. Here are some some citizens burning their draft cards and cards in protest of the war. One of the most famous protests was by a guy named Cassius Clay. You know him as heavyweight champion Muhammad Ali. He was drafted in the U.S. military, but he refused to join because he believed he was a conscientious objector. He objected to war and death because of his beliefs in Islam. He was arrested and stripped of his heavyweight belt. He lost about 3 years of his, probably the prime of his career. Eventually, he appealed all the way to the Supreme Court in Clay versus U.S., and they sided with him that he had the right not to serve. Eventually, he's going to win his heavyweight championship belt again, but what a brave thing to do, to stand up when you're at the height of your career. And even if he was drafted in the U.S. military, he probably wouldn't have saw any military action. He would have been kind of like doing shows for people, but he said, no, I'm against this war. Some quotes that he said about Vietnam, and this is just white people trying to attack colored people, yellow people in Vietnam, as he kind of put it, or brown people, he says, in Vietnam. And there he is, just in case you don't know who he is. This is him knocking out Sonny Liston to win his first heavyweight championship belt. The turning point of the war is the Tet Offensive. The Tet is a holiday. It's a Vietnamese New Year's. And previous years, Vietnamese soldiers had taken this day off because it's a very important day in their culture. But in 1968, they decided to do a sneak attack where 84,000 communist soldiers, they attacked more than 100 cities and 12 U.S. military bases in South Vietnam. Now, this was an utter military failure. 40,000 of the 84,000 communists were dead, and only 3,000 U.S. Soldiers were killed on that day. But it's the turning point of the war because it shows that the U.S. could not defend South Vietnam from North Vietnam. Nothing was secure. They could attack at any time. This war is going to last forever, and this changed the whole morale of the U.S. home front. Like, this war is never going to end. We're going to just keep Americans are just going to keep dying, and we're going to waste all this money for absolutely nothing because we cannot win this war. So, Tet Offensive is the turning point of the Vietnam War. Here you can see they invade all these different military bases all over the country. We had nothing protected. They can attack at any time. This is them marching. This guy's clapping. Yeah, I'm going to go fight the Americans. And again, militarily, it was a disaster for the Vietnam, but psychologically and morally, morale-wise, it was a huge victory and a death blow to the American soldiers. 1968, LBJ decides not to run because he is so unpopular due to the Vietnam War. RFK, Robert F. Kennedy, the younger brother of JFK, decides he's going to run for president, and he gets assassinated while he's running for president. And he believed that he had a very good shot of winning the presidency. And he gets assassinated 2 months after MLK was assassinated. Richard Nixon is going to go on to win the election, promising to end the war because the Democrats couldn't find a better candidate than RFK. So this is RFK in a kitchen in a California hotel after making a speech, getting assassinated by a man named Sirhan Sirhan, a Palestinian who didn't like his views on Palestine and Israel. And that's Richard Nixon becoming president after losing in 1960 to RFK's older brother, JFK. The best thing that Nixon did was he hired Henry Kissinger to be his Secretary of State or to help deal with foreign relations. Henry Kissinger was a German Jew who escaped Nazism and came over to America and is going to run the idea of Vietnamization. What this is instead of having American troops fight this war, why don't we just train the South Vietnam to defend their own borders? And by doing this, we can withdraw U.S. troops. We did the same tactic in the Iraq War. We trained the Iraqi military to handle their own fighting, and we were able to back out. So you could see it was hugely successful because 1969 to 1972, it's going to reduce it from 500,000 troops to less than a quarter of 100,000 troops, 24,000 troops. The bad thing that Nixon did was he started secretly bombing neighboring Cambodia. Because of the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, presidents could send military personnel anywhere they wanted, but he didn't tell the American people or Congress. He just started bombing them and then sent 80,000 troops into Cambodia. So instead of ending one war, he actually expanded the war for a while. There's Henry Kissinger, one of the most brilliant men in American politics history. Anti-war under Nixon. We have the Kent State shootings, this college in Indiana. They're protesting Nixon after they found out about him starting to bomb Cambodia. They burnt that ROTC building, which was on most college campuses. The National Guard was sent in, and they killed 4 and 9 college students that were unarmed. This was a major travesty, a sad part in Vietnam War and American history. We also have the Pentagon Papers. During LBJ's administration, he wanted the Pentagon, which is the U.S. military's headquarters, to write the history of the Vietnam War, and it had a lot of secret documents in there, and it pretty much showed how the government misled the country about the war. First, about the Tonkin Gulf incident, and then about faking numbers and this and that, and keep persuading Americans that this was the right war to do. This got leaked to the New York Times. It was mostly about LBJ, but Nixon tried to hide them because it would make the president look bad. So that's why Nixon wanted to hide them. There is Kent State. There's a National Guard rushing in on the college protesters. And there is a Pulitzer Prize winning photo of a young college student mourning the death of one of her friends who was, as you can see, unarmed. 1972, Nixon's going to run again. He's going to run against George McGovern, this liberal Democrat who was totally against the war and believed that all war should end. It was a blowout. Nixon won this pretty easily. He wasn't a very strong candidate, George McGovern. So quickly after Nixon is reelected, they have a ceasefire that was negotiated between American foreign ambassadors and North Vietnamese. So they end fighting there, and the Americans start vacating South Vietnam. When the Americans left, South Vietnam had no chance. They were attacked by North Vietnamese, and they surrendered, unifying Vietnam under the communist flag. Vietnam is still a communist country today, even though they are a major trading partner with the United States today. Capitalism has creeped into Vietnam, and they're actually doing pretty well economically. This is Kissinger meeting with North Vietnamese leaders in Paris to order that ceasefire so they could end the war. This is us embarrassingly leaving South Vietnam. All these South Vietnamese that had supported us during the really long war that we fought, we just kind of left them there. And a lot of them probably sadly died under the hands of communists who took over Saigon once we left. This was on American television. Now, what's extraordinary about this is we had a small country without much resources or military supplies defeat the greatest military power on earth at that time. Here's the numbers: 185,000 South Vietnamese soldiers. Again, that's on our side. They died, and a half a million civilians died. 1 million Viet Cong and North Vietnamese soldiers dead. There's probably even higher numbers than that. They said for every 10 Vietnamese person that was killed, only one American was killed. So we actually killed way more than them because of our weaponry, but they had the will to fight and they didn't want to give up, and we did. We have orphans. We have 58,000 American dead. This was the longest war in American history until the Afghanistan war surpassed it. 300,000 were wounded, especially by the punji sticks and the booby traps. A lot of people came back with their legs blown off, and a lot of them turned into homelessness and or drug addicts after the war. And a lot of them were called baby killers when they came back. They were not seen as heroes like the World War II soldiers, but as kind of villains. We spent $150 billion for this war, which is probably in the trillions in today's money. That could have been used for poverty issues and Social Security and whatever else. One thing that we did get right was the Wars Power Act. This is going to reverse the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, where the president had the right to declare war. It's going to give it back to Congress. So only Congress can declare war and send military troops around the world. But there is one caveat: the president can send the military anywhere he wants for a 60-day period. But after 60 days, he has to get a declaration of war from Congress. If not, they have to leave. Last but not least, this is the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C. What's unique about this, it lists all the 58,000 Americans that were killed. But how they do it is not by alphabetical order, but by chronological order, by when they were killed. So, for example, if we're looking at 1975, if a man was killed at 12:01, 1975, he would be first on the list. All right, at the end of the list would be 11:59, 1975. So you actually can find the person in chronological order. The artist also decided to have it in this black marble. I guess it's marble, so you could see yourself, your reflection in it, kind of showing the somber mode of the Vietnam War and its unpopularity. A pretty interesting place to go if you ever have a chance to do it. You should definitely check it out. And that is it. I hope you enjoyed. I had a great time. See you later. Bye bye. See if I can exit it now.